Yesterday, President Donald Trump issued a strong warning, demanding that Venezuela immediately end all support for drug trafficking networks in the Caribbean. But Caracas completely ignored it. Instead of de-escalating, they sent F-16 seconds to circle dangerously close to U.S. warships offshore. The Caribbean Sea was still wrapped in darkness when the Spy 1D radar aboard USS Gerald R suddenly spiked. Two tiny, fast, low-flying, almost invisible returns were cutting across the water from the southwest. They were two Venezuelan F-16 Amperes jets, flying just 36 meters above the sea. Caracas wanted to intimidate a U.S. destroyer, but they had no idea they were diving straight into the jaws of death. What they were looking for was not a 9,000-ton destroyer. It was USS Gerald R. Ford, a multi-billion-dollar supercarrier carrying 70 combat aircraft, shielded by 6 escort ships and a dense defensive web. A single misfired burst could blow the entire Caribbean into a geopolitical disaster. And these pilots were about to pull the trigger. 5:05 a.m. A Venezuelan pilot squeezed the trigger for 1.2 seconds. 34 tracers slashed across the water, passing less than a meter from the Ford's hull, an act serious enough to be considered armed provocation. In an instant, the entire CSG-2 shifted to combat status. The phalanx CIWS roared. Missile hatches opened. 2F divided by A-18E Super Hornets shot off the deck like steel spears. Neither of the two Venezuelan pilots knew that the intelligence they'd been given was 18 hours out of date, enough time for the entire U.S. strike group to move 80 kilometers. They believed they were closing in on a stray destroyer. But the show of force filming mission quickly turned into a death run. When they dropped to 50 meters, the APG-66 started showing signals that made no sense at a range of 68 kilometers. The F-16's aging radar suddenly displayed a target with a radar cross-section 12 times larger than a destroyer. A steel mass over 330 meters long and 100,000 tons was moving like a giant shadow on the sea's surface. Herrera choked. "Luis, that's not Echo 7. But by then, it was far too late to turn back. Caracas wanted the footage, and they had flown into a deadly trap. When the two F-16 seconds descended to just 36 meters, sea winds smashed into the canopies, shaking them so hard the HUD displays blurred. But they still held 510 knots to stay beneath U.S. radar coverage. Their only problem: they didn't know they were edging into the thickest defensive bubble on the planet, where every movement is tracked by 28 radars down to the millisecond. On the Ford, radar officers saw something abnormal: 2 contacts closing in at suicidal altitude. They ignored radio warnings. They didn't activate IFF. They didn't change heading. In the CIC, Captain Mark Dalton could only mutter one short line: "Who do they think we are? A light destroyer?" And the level 2 alarm went off immediately. Right then, the 6 escort ships around the Ford shifted into a clamp ring formation. The CEC system fused all the data into a single brain. F-16 speed, bank angle, altitude, everything fed into an anti-intrusion algorithm programmed to react in under 4 seconds. To it, the two F-16 seconds were almost completely stripped bare over the sea. At an altitude so low that sea mist licked the landing gear, Luis Herrera still pushed the throttle forward. Caracas wanted a powerful shot for the morning news. They needed footage of a close pass on a U.S. destroyer. But the truth on radar was undeniable. What lay ahead wasn't a 9,000-ton ship. It was a 100,000-ton floating city, defended like a nuclear fortress. Inside the cockpit, the APG-66 kept jumping like it had gone mad. The radar return was so huge it nearly filled the entire screen. Herrera swallowed hard. There was no way back. The filming mission had turned into a strategic confrontation he had never been trained for. He only managed to say over the radio, "Luis, we really screwed up." But by then, the Americans had already seen them. When the Ford confirmed 2 unknown contacts closing in, The strategic communication line linking the Navy, NSA, FBI went live instantly. At the Federal Anti-Narcotics Center in Miami, an FBI agent made an urgent report. They're maintaining a hostile approach vector. If this is a warning, it's gone way too far. Reaction time was now counted in seconds. In the Ford's Combat Information Center, a 3D map showed the F-16 seconds trajectory pointed straight at the flight deck. FBI cartel specialists were patched into the analysis channel immediately. A calm, low voice came through the encrypted link. Caracas does not have control of its military. This is not a show of force flight. That sentence sent a chill down the spine of many officers on board. Out at sea, the two Super Hornets had already dropped below 1,000 meters. Locking onto the F-16 seconds from just 3.5 kilometers away, the American fighters rolled inverted and descended, leaving two long white trails slashing across the sky. In an instant, the entire airspace around the fort turned into an arena where the slightest move could blow a war wide open. Herrera saw the missile lock, warning flash red on his HUD. The RWR howled like tearing metal. He shouted into the radio, "Carlos, brake left, brake now!" But the comms channel suddenly turned to static. An FBI agent's voice cut in over a monitoring frequency. "Lock strength increasing. If they don't turn back in 10 seconds, we lose the Caribbean." As Herrera struggled to keep the jet steady in the radar storm, USS Gridley fired two Mach 58 flares, drawing a 900-meter line of fire across the sky. That was the war boundary crossing. It meant accepting full confrontation. The two Super Hornets moved in so close that the Venezuelan pilots could clearly see the Americans' helmets. A tiny error in angle and four fighters would erupt like deadly fireworks. 5:19 a.m. Caracas was still broadcasting the order. "Hold your ground." The two F-16 seconds continued charging straight into the no-fly zone despite every warning. USS Gridley switched to weapons hot. A RIM 116 ram roared off the rail at Mach 2.4, leaving a white streak slashing across the sky. All Herrera heard was the system screaming, "Missile inbound." 2 seconds. In desperation, Herrera yanked the stick to the limit. The F-16 banked to nearly 74 degrees, the frame shaking as if it were about to disintegrate. The ram streaked past his cockpit by only 41 meters, close enough to strip paint off the right wing. In Miami, an FBI officer whispered over the tactical net, "If that had been off by 5 meters, we'd be talking about a war right now." But the US still didn't want to pull the final trigger. Super Hornet 211 dropped to just 90 meters, hard locking onto Mejia's F-16. On the American pilot's HUD, a cold line of text appeared. "Aim 9. X kill probability, 98%. Mejia tried a desperate Cobra-style maneuver, but the old generation F-16 responded 34% slower. He couldn't escape the blade coming for him. 5:21 a.m. Fox 2. The AIM-9X left the rail, accelerating to Mach 2 inches, just 1.3 seconds. It homed in on the heat plume from the F-16's engine, the hottest object in the Caribbean sky at that moment. The explosion flashed at 27 meters altitude. The F-16 split into 2 pieces, turning Mejia into a shadow in just 0.04 seconds. Herrera screamed, "Carlos! Oh God! Carlos!" In the Ford's command center, the numbers flipped red one after another. One target had been dealt with. One target was still inbound. The two Super Hornets tightened into a pincer loop, closing in from 2 directions. The fire control computer projected kill time. 6 seconds. An FBI voice came across the internal line. "This is no longer cartel interdiction. This is a national incident. End it clean." 5:23 a.m. Herrera's F-100PW-200 engine began to overheat. The OVHT light flickered like an arrhythmic heartbeat. He tried to pull the jet up to 360 meters to escape, but his biggest mistake was climbing, because the USCEC system instantly tagged it as an attack-run maneuver. On the battle plot, the F-16 symbol turned yellow, then red, indicating that auto-kill mode had been engaged. In the Ford CIC, the massive HUD display showed Herrera's speed ticking up by 11 knots, too small for a human to notice, but more than enough for the algorithm. Two weapons officers spoke in unison. Target escalating. Request permission to fire. The command room was deathly silent. Only the faint hum of electronics remained. A slight nod at that moment could blow the entire Caribbean sky apart. 5:24 a.m. The armed light flipped on inside Super Hornet 211's cockpit. The AIM-120D entered ready-to-fire mode. The HUD countdown ticked. 03, 02. Every heart in the CIC clenched. From Miami, an FBI agent whispered over the line, "If they shoot, none of us are sleeping tonight." The entire Western Hemisphere seemed to hold its breath. In that life-or-death instant, Herrera let go of the stick. He shut down all radar, dropped speed to 290 knots, and flipped on his surrender lights, the bravest decision of his entire career. The red icon instantly turned blue on the CEC display. The system automatically aborted the firing chain at the 3rd second. A regional war was averted by a pilot choosing survival over escalation. The two Super Hornets broke in opposite directions, holding a distance of 2.4 miles, escorting the scorched F-16 out of U.S. waters. No one said a word. No one even dared breathe loudly. Even after the F-16 left U.S. airspace, the Ford CIC remained as silent as a church. Everyone understood. Those last 3 seconds were the gap between peace and a war the world was not ready for. 5:26 a.m. As the F-16 exited U.S. waters, the first political shockwaves erupted. Encrypted links from Colombia to Brazil all lit up with alarms. In Washington, regional alert systems automatically activated. Analysts immediately saw the terrifying reality. This was no longer just an air combat incident. It had become a hemispheric crisis. By 5:40, USS Gerald R. Ford had uploaded all 19.2 gigabytes of radar and cockpit audio data into the CEC network. Just a few minutes later, the data reached the Pentagon and the White House. Experts only needed to watch once to see it clearly. The F-16 fired first, flew low, and ignored every radio warning. There was no other way to interpret it. The truth now had a definite shape, but in Caracas, that truth was twisted instantly. At 6:10 a.m., state television aired an emergency bulletin declaring, "Our two pilots were attacked without provocation by U.S. blank naval forces." The words, "without provocation," spread like sparks in a regional powder keg. High above the Caribbean, Herrera heard that broadcast over local radio. He knew full well that the story being crafted was nothing like what he had just faced to survive. At 6:22, Brazil raised its northern alert system to yellow. The Dominican Republic closed its civilian air corridors. Trinidad activated coastal radar. For the first time in 17 years, all 3 Caribbean early warning networks went live simultaneously. An FBI officer in Miami sighed. "One more bad statement, and we're back on the front page this morning." At 7 a.m., the CIA sent an urgent assessment. The likelihood of Venezuelan escalation within the next 72 hours was 54%, far too high for any government. At 7:20, the Pentagon called an emergency meeting. Experts analyzed every frame of the AIM-9X detonation, every cram alert level, every radio call from Herrera. What they saw left the entire room silent. The war had stopped exactly at the last 3 seconds. By 8 a.m., the global news cycle exploded. Headlines from Buenos Aires to London screamed, "Venezuelan jet shot down over Caribbean." U.S. carrier involved in armed clash. The truth was distorted by the sheer speed of the media, but inside the carrier strike group, every sailor knew if the AIM 120D had been launched just one heartbeat later, the entire region would have woken up to war. Experts now call it the 3-second night. The moment when history could have turned a different way, when the last Venezuelan F-16 disappeared beyond the horizon. The Caribbean calmed as if it had never trembled, but on the Ford's command deck, everyone felt something else. Real power isn't in pulling the trigger, but in stopping before it's too late. From Cram to Super Hornet, every system was capable of shredding the enemy. But it was human restraint that saved an entire hemisphere. Those 3 seconds of silence kept the world standing at the edge of the abyss. And sometimes, the greatest wars are won by the decision not to fire.